Yeah, okay. So, you know, the lecture today will introduce these concepts of poiesis and empowerment. And I think I mentioned empowerment before. And kind of reference why I want to mention poiesis. And in some of the papers, Poiesis is mentioned more explicitly, less explicitly. But I mean, there's this other question that came up, I think, in the discussion is why do we want to make music? Uh, so somehow we'll go from that kind of a free energy as homeostasis, as some kind of an organism that exists in a music environment, to the question of what drives and what motivates that. So I think this is kind of a question that uh, requires, first of all, accepting the basic premise. If we treat music as some sort of an organism that generates sound, generates music in a world of other sounds. Um, so the purpose of the organism, which could be the brain, could be a machine learning model, is to be able to uh, predict surprise. Now, in what sense surprise? Because the outside world, the world of musical examples, sound effects, whatever that world is, which is basically uh, sensed or received through the senses and then processed. So this kind of basic approach that this kind of ecology of music exists. Each musical piece or musical mind exists in a world of other sounds, and it has somehow to coexist with it. So yeah, it kind of precludes a lot of questions about how new music can emerge, how things can develop further, why we create music. So maybe in that sense, some motivation and Pugliese start touching upon these questions. But this definitely will not tell you why somebody would want to create new music. So the question of creativity and originality and always kind of changing your models uh, is still kind of going to be left there a little bit to speculate. But the basic assumption is that we have a generative model, which means a set of musical opportunities and musical materials, as I said, a rhetoric technique or some other method that basically has a lot of sketches, a lot of possibilities. Each one of them basically is generated by some um, latent state. So we have this Bayesian approach, right? That we basically have these two variables. We have the sensations, we have the meaning, very abstract approach. But I think the kind of this association of sensations to perceptions. So perceptions are kind of these higher level structures that basically are responsible for understanding or giving meaning to something which is more of that physical phenomena or physical acoustic, but maybe it could be also notated music. For the purpose of this discussion, really, you have to define what is your, input, what is your surface, and then what happens inside that system. And what the system does, it does inference, it does prediction. Basically, we mentioned inference like the Bayesian brain, tinnitus. So the brain starts generating its own sensations if it cannot have this external input, and this whole idea of uh, you know consciousness as controlled hallucination. Basically, you have to imagine something, and then you have the sensations, the real world that kind of controls your imagination. So if you cannot imagine something, you don't perceive it, because then it basically, not being able to imagine means that you don't have really latent states that explain how these sensations can happen. So there's kind of several assumptions here, which in some sense are kind of looking at music as some kind of ecological creature coexisting in a larger environment determined by style, by other conventions. And then basically what separates this organism from the environment is, in many of the papers, it's mentioned the term Markov blanket. So Markov blanket basically is what translates the external, basically the sensation into the representation, but it also relates external states to internal states, because we assume that there are external states that create the sensations or the physical effects that then we sense, and then they are translated back to internal states. So the reason that we want kind of to work in a internal external states world is that we assume that there is a meaning to that external world, which is also hidden, but these are external states. That meaning creates the physical effect. That physical effect is sampled by our senses, and then we understand it by mapping this to our internal states. So Markov blanket basically makes this relation. And again, this is the quote from the Thinking Through Other Minds paper. So heuristically, this means that one can ascribe probabilistic belief to internal states in the sense that they're about something, namely external states. Okay. So again, thank you for bearing with me with these definitions, because unless you have been using these techniques and training machine learning models, and you're used to this technique, for a composer, performer, or musicologist, somebody who thinks about how we listen about music perception, cognition, this basic assumption about defining music as an organism in a homeostasis with a musical environment is weird. I mean, it's strange. So I think that kind of takes this whole class into the different perspective about music. Really, it's kind of organism existing in the world of other musics. So again, from our last paper, we have this idea of internal states. We have the sensations that we basically translate into perceptions or some sort of a meaning. Now, these sensations, which are basically kind of sampling in the physical domain, a world that has its own logic, and the logic of the external world is through external states. So early on, when we introduced them, we basically assumed that external states and internal states are the same. In the follow-up papers, and this is really kind of the Friston free energy work kind of differs from a lot of the machine learning approach, is that he explicitly makes differences between the external states, internal states, and also introduces the question of action. Okay. Now, action means that we can also act to change the environment, and we can change the external states. So if this is sort of a general model of intelligence, and the purpose of intelligence is basically to be able to explain the world, there are these different aspects that could be now mapped into this model, right? The sensations that minimize the agent's surprise, right? Perception, okay, also kind of creates a different surprise. Sorry, let me go back. And in that sense, it tries basically to map the external states, or what it expects, how the meaning changes in the external world, to the meaning that it can derive internally from its sensations. And also it can think about action that also minimizes the surprise, and in that sense, you can change or create something, create an impact on the external world. Now, in robotics, it starts playing function, playing a role. It is a function that we're going to look into. In a lot of the work on learning musical style or imitating music, usually the action is not explicitly present. But I kind of wanted to kind of go over and remind ourselves um, of these concepts. And, and if we kind of move one step further, we also spoke about musical information dynamics, which was uh, that second or another approach to um, the Bayesian brain, which is really about making predictions. Oh, jumps. Okay. So making predictions, it sort of seems to be a very different formalism, but I'll try to kind of to relate the two. And in this one, we said, what's musical information dynamics? We're trying to see or quantify the aspect of prediction by a slightly different approach. And the idea is that you can actually see them. They're kind of related, and that's one of the things I want to talk today. But just as a setting, as a conceptual problem, what we have is we have a receiver or a listener that has some prior knowledge, experience of music. It could be basically the past of the music that he already heard, right? And then there is the new music that comes in, and the idea is that also there's this active inference or active perception that tries to predict the music, and the way to measure the extent of kind of how this mechanism works is to think about this idea of how much information is transmitted from, or how much common information exists between, in some sense, this is the past because the receiver already heard something. Could be past experience, it could be the immediate past, and the new music that um, arrives at this moment, and can measure this in terms of information. And what is information? Again, it's these are the terms that we kind of mentioned. I don't think we ever really mathematically bothered to describe them, but we mentioned entropy. So the entropy is, in some sense, the uncertainty about the possible outcome of some variable. So if x is, the set of possible instances of music which are unrelated to anything else, so we treat every instance of music as independent, it doesn't depend on the past, and we look at them, we can talk about the uncertainty or the entropy or the variety of possible musical materials. And in the case of conditional entropy, I know it keeps jumping, in the case of conditional entropy, this is the remaining uncertainty about x if we know y. So this is kind of the reduction in the uncertainty about x if we do take into account the uncertainty given the past. And this is the definition of information. It also, it kind of takes a moment to get used to the notion that actually information is a relative measure. There is no such thing as absolute information. Information is basically a reduction in uncertainty. So I think one of the examples for this effect is, let's say, if you're reading an article in the newspaper that talks about, I don't know, it could be, let's say, a cure for COVID, right? It depends who is the reader, right? If you are, a medical professional, you'll be reading or focusing on some medical aspects of this. If you are maybe economist, you look at different evidence. If so, depending on what is your domain, that article will reduce your uncertainty about things that you already are interested in. So each one of them will basically derive different knowledge from this article. So in that sense, you know, the information that the present carries is relative to what was in the past. And this is kind of the notion. And we can think about how much structure there is in a signal as basically in that reduction of uncertainty. Now, when it does make sense, okay, let's think about two extreme cases. Let's say you had totally random music, okay, that has no structure. Every event, musical event, is completely surprising. It's not dependent on what happened before. We just throw a dice. In that case, there is the uncertainty of that event. But if we consider the past, it will not help us predict anything about the future. So the uncertainty will be the same. Okay. So h of x given y will be the same as h of x. And basically, in that sense, the past doesn't carry any information about the future, right? So for a totally random source, this condition will not be any different from this. So these two will be similar. And in some sense, if we assume that what the brain does is try to process information, if in some sense this I of xy indicates, you know, how much the brain actually managed to understand the music, in that case, because nothing is predictable, the meaning of that music for the listener will be zero, okay? Because it actually doesn't convey any, it doesn't let him make any sense. If the sense making is predicting, it doesn't manage to predict anything. You can also look at the other extreme where this is super predictable, okay? So if x is deterministic or closely to deterministic, the uncertainty about x given y could be very small, okay? But then the question is, if the process itself is very predictable, its entropy can be also very low. So if you have a constant sequence, okay, the entropy of that sequence will be close to zero. Of course, it will be very predictable, but you'll have very small number minus very small number. It becomes very, the total information is transferred from past to present is also very small. So what we have is like very predictable sequences are not interesting, very random sequences are not interesting, right? And we kind of see in this effect, I think Mira was pointing to this kind of a inverted U function, right? Also in information dynamics, there was this effect. So it seems that the optimal experience is when you have a lot of uncertainty. So this is big, but it's very predictable. So this is small. Now, this doesn't explain really, you know, this idea of, you know, the homeostasis, but we'll see in a second that they're actually related. If you think about prediction as part of you know, time as part of the system. So to do this, we kind of have to talk about so-called action perception loop, and this is really more, right, at least in the technical domain, relates to, let's say, robotics. So what is an action prediction loop? We have the states in the world, the environment. So these are the external states. They have their own dynamics. They create sensations, right? These sensations are translated to internal states. And this is just taken from different paper I didn't put here the reference, but I can provide it later. So just the notation is different, but this is basically the external states, the sensations, the internal states, but then there is this action, okay? And the action, which is done by the agent, can change the environment. So the environment changes because it has its own dynamics, but it can also be changed through action, right? This new state of the external world will create a new sensation. Okay, that sensation will affect basically the state, the next step in our understanding of the world. Of course, the action also, we take into account the action, we take into account the previous memory. So the M's are called memory instead of internal states. And basically this process keeps on going on and on. So environmental state, sensor value or sensation, action and memory state, and these numbers are the time, okay? So in this case, the free energy principle becomes the choice of actions that minimize expected surprise, okay? So again, the surprise is about the sensations, but we can also choose our actions to minimize the surprise. And also we try to learn, the memory state, so learn the internal representation, so we kind of understand. So all of this is basically done by the system, okay? Now predictive information becomes intrinsic motivation. I will talk about this in a second. So just to convince you that this thing kind of works in some sense, there was a lot of work on trying to create or see if a machine, something like a robot, can actually learn something by using this principle. And the principle is basically it tries to maximize the impact of the actions that they have on the environment, so it will have least surprise, okay? So I'll play some examples, and let's see if I can switch. Yeah. So for instance, these kind of playful robots, playful machines, I mean, there are a lot of videos, so let's see how much we want to spend on looking. They're all fun examples. Kind of the initial idea is generalizing the idea of homeostasis to homeokinesis. So I kind of just mentioned this term last week without explaining, but kind of the notion here is that homeokinesis is make the robot sensitive to small variations in sensor values, so it will be, very responsive. So, meaning to make the robot sensitive, a robot sensitive to small variation in sensor values induce large variation in motor values, resulting in even larger sensorial responses, and so on. So this will drive the robot towards an hyperactive, chaotic behavior. Okay, the way into complete chaos is counterfacted by both the physics of the robot itself and the decline of understanding of the chaotic regime. As a solution of these conflicting effects, the robot develops a kind of self-exploration of its bodily affordances in a more or less playful way, with a tendency to develop development due to increasing cognitive ability. So it actually builds more and more complex model. So the memory itself and the ability to move from one state and translate sensations into memory becomes much more elaborate. This also guides its ability to act on the world. And there's some examples here. Unfortunately, most of these videos you have to download and see, but let me see where there were some. No, these are all downloadable. Here, okay. So let's go. I mean, it goes like sequence of levels of explanation. So that's the basic homeokinesis, and then they talk about predictive information maximization. So we can watch this one. This is a YouTube video. So we have the assumption of homeokinesis, okay, that basically kind of allows the robot to maximally develop its ability to sense the environment and respond to it. And really the objective is without any other prescribed action. So this robot is actually not doing anything useful, okay? It just tries kind of to play with the environment uh, and position itself in the best way so it'll have the most amount of freedom. Okay, so there's this kind of a idea which corresponds to that maximum entropy idea in the free energy or the predictive information here. So this is where we talk about predictive information maximization. So what is it? So information theory now, okay, is basically a tool to express principles to drive autonomous systems because it is domain invariant and allows for an intuitive interpretation. So what it means, okay, so this talk about the paper itself, but they basically take some kind of a nonlinear non-stationary system. Nonlinear is like all these neural networks and stuff. And it's really a lot of technical talk here, and they try to basically estimate this predictive information. Time local means they always test themselves in every instance in time. They try to see how well it was predicted. And this way they can measure basically how well the robot performs. Okay, so it's very much like the listener that tries to predict the next step. You can maybe musically interpret this as maybe also a musician, not just predicting, but also producing music. Okay, so there is some aspect of controller, which means something that actuates or does stuff in the environment. And basically, this information principle, okay, is formulated at the level of behavior and translated to dynamics of the synapses. And then basically they did a lot of experiments with these systems. And eventually there's this idea that you have a lot of, at least in the robot, a lot of parts, okay? And these robots could be either humanoid-like, so you have arms and legs, and or you have these more kind of mechanical things. But all of these joints and all of these limbs and parts sort of start cooperating spontaneously without really having any centralized control. So there is also a very kind of powerful assumption here, is that this system is self-organizing, okay, just by the principle of it trying to maximize its ability to predict its own outcome. It develops coordination, okay? So it's like, a child that learns to walk. He does this without really a specific intent. It's not that, he has an instruction to go from place A to place B. He just manages to eventually explore the world better if he starts walking, and he's trying to play around with his limbs, and he finds ways to coordinate his muscles and his I forgot what's the name for the sense of your position in space, but he kind of builds this model that actually works in the environment, and then suddenly he's able to coordinate its movement. Okay, now what it means about sound, I don't know. So maybe you have a lot of parameters, a lot of possibilities to generate sound. We don't exactly have joints and arms and legs to move. We have something much more abstract. But if you think about a lot of parameters that can combine together to be music, and again, I don't have any direct mapping. You could think about something that is coordinating different sounds together into chords. You can think about some other ability to coordinate things in time. So kind of musical affordances, they sort of like come together to be coordinated, to be able actually to produce a meaningful structure or meaningful operation over time. And this is basically self-emerging. Why it's self-emerging? Because it does get some feedback in the environment. So the robot can fall, it can get up. So in that sense, kind of this trial and error in the musical domain where you do have some sort of a feedback or some relation to the environment, either by comparing, your predictions of your own behavior, or getting some feedback from the environment, eventually emerges into uh, something that can operate in that environment. So, all right. I mean, instead of reading every sentence here, I guess I go back and visit this. Let me play some videos. I think that makes much more sense to see that. So, they start with some kind of a robot that has no ability or no coordination between the limbs, and it basically randomly tries randomly to activate different parts. He is constrained by this box, and it starts suddenly figuring out that, pushing with his head and then pushing with his legs allow him to explore more of that space, and eventually it learns to stand up, it learns to hold, and once it kind of explores this enough, basically there's kind of a logic of control that emerges. This is an example where each one of these little parts is really not, there is no centralized control, okay? And if you can see, where's my mouse? And then, it tries kind of to learn more and more according to, some parameters it shows, and it creates this ability to move. Okay, so this ability to roll and move was an emergent behavior. This robot didn't know that it has to coordinate its movement this way. And now you have these kind of two competing models, and they start learning in some sense just by playing around how they can interact with each other. And this kind of research on playful machines, at least in graphics, seems to be pretty convincing. So this simulation learns to walk just by randomly trying to kind of coordinate its legs, and basically forward motion and the ability to walk emerges without any written algorithm. So there's nobody writing a code. It's not pre-wired, and it basically emerges just from the ability to predict its own next step and feel that it has the coordination. So here it's okay. More examples of kind of learning to play with a bungee rope, and yeah, we're almost done. So yeah, even examples of fighting. I think there were a lot of questions so far, so I just don't know where my mouse is. Okay. Just quickly, maybe I'll answer some questions. We can also scroll up and see some other examples of these playful robots. This is, I think, the physical rendering of this. So I'll look at the chat while these things play. I don't know if we have. It has a little sound here. Yeah, it doesn't really. The sound is not important, but it kind of plays around, tries to learn to coordinate, make something useful with this bottle, so it learns to basically spin it around and understands that now it can actually create a consistent movement. Okay, so it amplifies a certain state because it becomes predictable. So it learns to juggle or learns to play around with things. So information is reduction in uncertainty. Okay, information is reduction in uncertainty uh, between two variables. Yeah. Um, yeah, exactly. So exactly what Mira wrote. It is the reduction of uncertainty of x if we know y. It's actually symmetric. It's the same reduction of uncertainty about y if we know x. Okay. In the case of time, we have this, you know, interpretation of the past happens before the future, but at least in terms of the mathematics, it's all the same. Um, okay, yeah. Well, thank you, Mira. Um, yeah. So exactly. So the uncertainty about the present is high, but given the past, it reduces the uncertainty. Yeah. But there needs to be also a challenge. Okay. Uh, well, I'm not about the drumming. In theory, yes. I mean, I'm not aware of any example that actually does it this way. I mean, that they actually show an emergent drumming. But yeah, in principle, yes, it would. Especially since it probably corresponds to some kind of a coordinate movement that it can repeat and create something predictable. So it learns concepts of rhythm just because also its own mechanics allows it to kind of coordinate these things. So I mean, this whole idea of affordances, internal affordances, in some sense correspond to the ability to make something that eventually it feels that it accomplished something. You know, once it starts making sense, once it starts predicting it, and it knows what to expect, this is the kind of movement that it will learn. Right? So, how complex will be the patterns? They depend on, you know, the ability of the of the brain of that robot to make sense of these patterns. So, the more patterns you have, you also have to have higher cognitive abilities. Uh, yeah, so that's kind of the overall idea. I mean, what's amazing is that it actually it actually works. So I think that's kind of a surprising effect. Um, so um, let's kind of go a little bit um, further with this concept. Um, so one can actually create these formal relations that lead to this concept of empowerment. Now, why we use the concept of empowerment? Just because I think it's intuitive. Free energy motivated by physics and maybe some cognitive models in brain, still very abstract. Predictive information, I think, is at least, sorry, for me, it's a little bit more intuitive, just because, there's a lot of literature about music that talks about anticipation, about implication, about realization, about making surprise. We talk about, sustained notes. We talk about cadential movement. Even the ideas of counterpoint that you create tension resolution. So there is something happening there. Of course, the whole Huron's sweet anticipation work on music, which is not information theoretic, but he does include aspects of probability in his analysis. So I think in that sense, predictive information, if you think about this as in anticipation, um, is at least for musicians probably more intuitive. And then there's the question of empowerment, which I think has this intuitive notion of just your motivation or intrinsic feeling that you have control over the world. um, Now, let's kind of review. I just use the notations from a paper about empowerment, but I'll explain these terms. Okay, so if you remember, we spoke about A's, okay, as actions, S as the sensations or the not the states. S, we're using this notation, right? S are the sensor values. Sensations are sensors. Um, so our sensations depend on previous actions. I mean, there are a lot of extra parameters here, so I won't. There's kind of a policy of how we choose the next action. And the idea is that in the free energy principle, we can kind of rewrite this, given that we have some kind of internal model of the world. We try basically to minimize this expression, this conditional entropy. It's to map this exactly to the equations that we've seen before. Will take a little bit more kind of algebra here, but the whole principle is that there is this energy which could be written as this measure of entropy or uncertainty of the sensor values, the sensations. So this is kind of the way to talk about free energy principle if you have action. The predictive information is the mutual information between past sensations and the future sensations, and this is symmetric. Okay, so in this case, basically, we look at the information from some time t all the way to, in this case, they kind of have an index k, so halfway, and then from halfway in the future. I mean, this is really specific to the article, but what I wanted to point out is this is the past, this is the future. So they have some kind of a sequence of length k half here, and from the k half to the k, another k half in the future, they measure this information. So it's not complete past to the immediate present, it's from a chunk in the past to some horizon in the future, okay? But it's still the idea of predictive informations. You are predicting your future sensations from past sensations. So in that sense, if sensations are the music itself, the musical surface, you might be, trying to predict, let's say, the next bar based on the previous bar. And of course, you have to take into account that you had some action policy and some model, okay? But this is the prediction of the musical surface. And here is the empowerment, and the empowerment is really the mutual information. You maximize this one. Also, you maximize this, okay? You maximize that mutual information. You maximize your empowerment, which is the relation between your sensations and the actions, okay? Now, basically your sensation at k steps in the future, how predictable there will be in the sense of how much mutual information it will be, given that you have some way of acting. Okay, see, if your actions are music that you produce, after k actions, you will be able to produce or to predict the musical result. Okay, now k could be a lot of movements that actually result in one event, or it could be also actions that take into account other musical events. But this is empowerment. So that empowerment was more that example of the robot learning to walk, learning to predict its own sensors based on coordinating its movement. So it learns actions. So these are kind of the formal relations. And why kind of mention that? Because I think it translates to some possible insights or answers as to why we actually want to make music, why we want to create new musical results, right? New musical compositions. So just kind of as the idea that predictive information is maximizing the predictive information is basically an intrinsic motivation that seeks to maximize the predictive information of the sensor process. I'm just kind of rewriting what I said before. You want to be able to predict your sensations. Empowerment, maximization, is an intrinsic motivation that seeks to maximize the, well, they call it technically channel capacity, but the ability, okay, so channel capacity from sequences of agent actions into subsequent sensor values. So this is kind of the idea that your impact your actions have maximal impact, maximal channel capacity, that's kind of the technical term, into the future. You actually can do and perform, and it's successful. Now, what happens here is that empowerment, so intrinsic motivation in some sense is this poiesis. The idea of poiesis is that something emerges out of nothing, okay? That there is this ability to create structure out of, that inspiration suddenly emerges, and you see that something can happen. So, the idea that this is something that drives the process is translated into these specific aspects of poiesis, like predictive information or predicting sensations, or having maximal impact on the world, which means having most effect through your actions on the sensations in the future. So empowerment maximization policy leads the agent to a state from which it can reach the highest number of future states within the present number of actions. So that principle of positioning yourself, frankly, without any goal, okay? The learning is not done by specifically executing an algorithm going from here to there, or having some kind of a code that tells you how to coordinate your legs and arms. It's just the idea that it tries to put itself in a position of control. Basically, it reaches the highest amount of possible states within the present number of actions. And this intrinsic motivation is essential dynamics of living systems based on assumption of autopoietic and activism. So here is kind of the idea of autopoiesis, that actually there is this desire of the organism to not only exist in the world, not just create the homeostasis, but also this homeokinesis that leads it to maximize the prediction, maximize the empowerment, and by this it actually is able to create new behaviors. Okay, so now if we already kind of went so far, I think I'll make a break pretty soon, because I think all of these concepts are sound very abstract, and my main reason of kind of going through this and convincing you to follow me is that you can actually see this happening in very mechanical ways. So there is kind of a proof that these ideas work. I think Rebecca, right? You asked me about ethics. So I'm not sure I'm going to answer exactly what you meant, because there's so many different aspects of ethics, and as I told before, it's not something that I really considered, but it reminded me of this, so I kind of found again this article. You can go and check it out, which tries to relate the concept of empowerment to the 3 laws of robotics by what happens to me? A science fiction writer.
I think it's Asimov.
Yeah, thank you. Of course, yeah, yeah. So Asimov, right, wrote these 3 laws of robotics, which you could think about as ethics, and the idea that the robot may not injure a human being, or through inaction allow a human being to come to harm. A robot must obey the orders given to it by human beings, except where the orders would conflict with the first law. So it cannot actually hurt another human being by obeying a different human being. And it has also to protect its own existence, okay, as long as such protection does not conflict with the first or second law, okay. Yeah, as much as Asimov wrote about science fiction, but it kind of became a quite established idea that we need to maybe program robots in ways that have some directives of how they should operate if they become autonomous or semi-autonomous, right? So in that article, actually, Science Daily gives this interpretation of ethics to a different article that actually claims that empowerment is a new law for robotics, and the idea is that uh, you can think about measuring empowerment not so much as with respect to the robot itself, but to a human that operates with the robot. Okay, so keeping humans safe consists of the robot acting to increase the human's own empowerment. So if the robot now becomes part of something that the human considers as a way to create actions and change its sensations, basically the robot has, I mean, the obedience of the robot is measured in the sense of, how much the robot contributes to the human empowerment. The robot becomes an extension of the human. So I think this concept is interesting in the sense that we talk a lot about, well, okay, what you do with all this computer music software that becomes more and more autonomous, right? I mean, is it going to be replacement for the musician, right? Is it an instrument or is it a composer, right? I mean, it's self whatever. I'm not saying it's self-aware, but it creates stuff that people might attribute to creativity, right? So here, kind of the idea is that you still consider that interaction of the robot with the human, but as the ethical use of. So I'm kind of making here a leap based on Rebecca's question and me kind of trying to think, how I'm going to answer this. So you could say that if we want to think about ethics of using computer music, especially compositional algorithms that sort of have their own ability for autonomy, okay, the ethical use of these algorithms is to increase the empowerment of the musician who uses them. Okay, having said that, it might sound very deep, but it could be also considered very trivial, right? It has to serve your compositional or performance needs by positioning you as a human in a better ability to act and predict the next musical outcome. So of course you have to be able to learn, to understand, to predict, but this is how you judge it. I mean, did it actually help your creativity? Did it help your sense of control of the world, your ability to position yourself uh, as the creator? So the other quote from that article is that, well, this was kind of more about the protection, but we don't want to be oppressively protected by robots to minimize any chance of harm. We want to live in a world where the robots maintain our environment. Okay. Yeah, so that's pretty much, I think, what I had in mind for this part. Yeah, I'll talk that. I think I'll make a pause right here. So I'll pause also
Can I
the
ask you
video.
a question about
Yeah.
that?
Okay, so I'll pause the recording and yeah, unless we want to record your question.
You can record my question. I don't
Yeah,
mind.
sure. Yeah, please. Okay. Oh,
That's
sorry.
okay.
Yeah,
That's
I'll go
okay.
back. Mm-hmm.
So going back to that
Yes. Mm-hmm.
topic, um,
This
so
one. Yeah.
if you
Mm-hmm.
can think back to when we did that concert and Gerard was there and he was
Yeah.
using
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember what was the platform he was using.
Yeah, it's Omax and different versions of Omax. Yeah,
Sure.
it's the open music with
Yeah.
basically yeah with Max, but yeah.
Mm. So for you as a
Mhm.
listener of that particular concert or
Mhm.
that specific method, what is pros and cons from a performance perspective that you see
Mhm.
out of that interaction?
Right. Okay.
That's
As a listener or as an improviser, because I was also playing there with
I
another
know.
version, the Somax, right? And actually it makes much more sense performing than listening,
Yeah,
frankly.
I
Yeah.
think so. For me, I mean, that's a question for you, which I'm
Mhm.
curious to answer. But for me, I think what was difficult was the idea of intuition when working with the machine,
Mhm.
because I was improvising and it was feeding back to me.
Mhm.
except it couldn't feel when I was ready to finish that phrase, or I was ready to move on, or I was
Right.
wanting to do something. So for me, it was at times very intuitive because we were working together, and then the other spectrum, like extremely counterintuitive. And I was like, oh, I want this to end. It's still going. And, you know, like
Right.
things like this. So I'm just curious, for you, what do you see within that platform?
So I think it's an excellent question, because you know, for creating a robotic musician, right, and that actually fulfills this as an ethics principle, whatever. You could also you know, think about this as basically a usability question. Uh, for such a machine to be useful, it actually has to be able to be a little bit more intelligent than it is right now, which means um, so where we stand with this kind of work on flow machines, OMAX, you know, VMO, whatever. I mean, it's all kind of very much related set of techniques. Uh, the idea, or what the current state of machine improvisation is, and of course, when I say current, it means more established. Of course, we're trying to solve some of the issues that I think you're pointing to, which is letting the machine understand where music goes and what is your intent in the future. Right now, what the machine does, it basically tries to capture your performance in the past, okay? Find some statistics of how patterns recombine and generate more of the same. So, you know, it's not really able to capture anything about larger structure, about telling a story, about narrative. All it does, it suggests you more variations of where you are currently. Now, the funny thing is that you know, once we start working with these techniques, François Pachet from Sony, you know, used this method, and he called it a flow machine. Okay, and there is actually an interesting article. I didn't bring it, but I can find it, where he actually took kids and also brought in musicians. I think I have maybe one of the videos down the slides, possibly. Um, so when we go down, I'll try to figure out if I include this or not. I can find it. So the idea of the name was continuator. Okay, that was the idea. That was the name of the system that actually François Pachet actually he patented this method. Okay, um, and what the continuator did, it was actually taking a method that was learning kind of the musical style, basically learning the statistics of music that somebody was showing it, okay, and it would generate the next phrase. So he basically used this in a real-time version to generate a continuation to what you did before. And then he let kids play with this, he let musicians play with it, and the question was, do you feel that this inspires or helps your creativity? So in that limited experiment, where you basically kind of play a little on the keyboard, right? Depending on what's your level of musicianship, you stop and the machine continues something in your own style, it could get you inspired, okay? So he claimed that, so he went a little bit overboard, I think, with the claim that this is a flow machine, flow based on this concept of Csikszentmihalyi, that it puts you in this optimal matching of challenge and skills, because it learns your patterns, so it kind of understands what your skill level is in the sense of like how creative, what patterns you use, and it suggests you more of that, and you feel empowered, and then, but it's the empowering of just continuation, okay? Now, I think what you were asking is not only being able to continue, it's not that you ran out of ideas for the local musical texture, right? You wanted now to start creating a story, which means you need to think about musical form, you think about expectations on much larger scale, right? And the models basically do not provide that yet, unless you agree ahead of time. So some of the more recent development of these omax and continuator type of things uh, actually are trying to specify, let's say, a scenario. It could be chord progression, but it could be some very abstract scenario. And then the machine will try to follow that score, which can be very abstract, with you. So at least it, but you have to specify this ahead of time. So if you had a design, a structural design before, then the machine will kind of know how to change its behavior. And that might solve it. But really, the ability to understand that you're ready to maybe come to a cadence, or you want to switch roles, or do any kind of a structural kind of narrative representation is still very much an open question. I mean, somebody has to. So even if that robot learned how to walk, uh, it will not just by chance. Well, maybe it can learn dance moves, right? But I don't know. It will not create kind of a significant choreography from beginning to end just by these principles of empowering itself. So I think here you actually touch on a very important questions: how far these theories can go, right? Why we actually tell stories and I'm not sure that these stories could be learned by thinking about the environment so much as what other, if the environment becomes other people, genres, style, culture, that becomes already something else. These schemas probably need something else. It needs maybe interaction with others. So the answer is, the long answer was what I was given. The short answer, we just don't know to do anything better than continue an existing texture. And if you have noticed, I mean, Gerard was sitting there and he would control the parameters. So if you wanted something higher level than just creating these textures, there was a human. So there is a human operator in that loop. Now, Jared Lewis had his own system that he would go and basically wrestle on stage, right? I think, what's the name of his improvisation software? Voyager? Yeah. George Lewis has this software Voyager that he actually performed a lot. It's way before the machine learning period. It wouldn't learn his gestures. He actually pre-programmed a lot of algorithmic kind of random behaviors, and he would go on stage. I'm not sure, although there is an article about his piece, I never exactly understood how much the system would listen to him. Okay, it definitely wouldn't learn his style. It was already pre-programmed, but there was a lot of randomness. It was generative. It was definitely a generative system with different regimes, and it would allow him to go on stage and react to the machine. So if the empowerment comes from the fact that you put yourself in a situation where a lot of things happen in surprising ways, and you basically are an actor, it serves a goal, but I mean that's a very different. So that system was not a learning machine. So I'm a little bit afraid to kind of bring that example. I mean, it's definitely one of the early formidable examples of machine improvisation. But since it's not a learning mechanism, I wouldn't say that it would be, the system will be in homeostasis with the human would be in a homeostasis with the system. So George Lewis knew, I mean, how to match the expectations. So I'm not saying it wasn't, he was empowered, but not so much by the machine helping him. It just gave him more opportunities to express himself. So, as a performance, it's also, totally valid. I mean, it makes an effect. But, yeah. And any other? I hope I answered.
Thank you.
It's a fun discussion. So I think it's important because there are more and more of these algorithms coming up, right? You have a lot of these machine learning algorithms now that, Google has this Magenta project, and they started coming out with plugins for Ableton to do all kinds of neural networks that can take clips and randomize them, but like by learning, okay? So a lot of them just doing continuation. They're doing basically texture synthesis. They learn some musical patterns, and some of them are already pre-trained in musical styles, so you can actually generate maybe something in a style of. So, it doesn't have to be your style. It could be already a generator that learned Bach. I mean, there are systems that can write pretty convincing Bach chorales. So then the question is, well, why do we want to use them? What's the opportunity? I think as a general, and I think, when my collaboration with Girard started, I mean, he's still in charge of so-called music representation team, music representation team, right? And his open music software was basically algorithmic composition software. It was a graphical environment that would allow you basically to program in Lisp by dragging chords, a little bit like Max does. But this was on symbolic music. But everything had to be specified as a logic. So our collaboration started when, we talked about the idea that you can actually use statistics. And I'll mention, the earliest thing was a program in Open Music that would take a musical piece and would make it generative. So you didn't have to program it. You could basically throw musical ideas and you'll create more of them. But it was always kind of rooted in the idea of computer-assisted composition. It was just an assistant to a composer. When flow machines came, which were doing this real-time or semi-real-time, you would play and it will generate something. And then came out with Omax that would be improvising with you. We started doing this in a live setting, which became much more exciting. But it still was kind of the idea that you don't have to program your musical algorithm. You provide examples and it generates more of the same with variations. And I must admit that, there are musicians who love it, but there are musicians who hate it because they say it's just parroting me, okay? I don't need somebody to give me more ideas of my own because I have plenty. I want somebody to work against. I want somebody to kind of oppose me, create a dialogue, create a confrontation, create basically some kind of a theatrical setting. And these machines, if they're not intentionally designed to do something like this, they will be basically just augmenting / parroting / mirroring whatever you do already. So it's still up to the musician to decide if it helps, if what it does empowers him or not. It could be also depressing him. Okay, so shall we maybe take a 15 minutes break? I think that's a good time. I mean, at least, I don't have anything right now to say more about this. And before we switch subjects, I think that would be a good pause.
By the way, there's a program on Adobe called Maximo, which is actually the movement, like machine learning stuff.
Okay.
At times the